Chapter 11, Building Customer Relationships Through Effective Marketing. I'm really glad that they start out with the idea of building relationships. In the past, marketing was all about razzle-dazzle and grabbing attention. But in recent years, it's really more important to think about what's called permission marketing and really building that relationship. And so as we start, I want to differentiate between marketing and advertising because very often people kind of conflate those two concepts. And in fact, advertising is a very important component of marketing, but it is just a component. And we'll drill down a little bit further into that in the next chapter that we talk about. But for now, I want to talk about marketing in, kind of a broader parameter, because it is more than just the communication portion. So before we get into that, kind of what it is, let's talk about some other key terms. I mentioned relationship marketing in terms of building an ongoing relationship with your customers rather than just trying to sell them stuff. So relationship marketing implies a couple things. It implies the idea of building trust. It implies asking permission before you communicate. And it also implies something called customer lifetime value, which is recognizing that, let's say somebody buys a car from you. Yeah, okay, that's depending on the price of the car, but let's say a $35,000 transaction, that's certainly worth something. But if you can convert them to your brand, if you can make them a Toyota buyer for life, think about what they are worth to you over their lifetime. So that's where building a relationship rather than a more transactional viewpoint can make a lot of sense, because it is actually a lot more expensive to get a new customer than it is to keep a current customer. So let's talk about the utility, which is the value added by marketing. Marketing can add various types of utility, and I'll let you take a look at those on the slide. But first, if you think about getting out of your biology or your law class, you're probably a little tired, maybe a little frazzled, looking for a pick-me-up. And one thing that could do that could be, let's say a Coke for the sake of argument. So which Coke is more valuable to you? The Coke that's in the Coke machine right outside of your classroom? Or the Coke that you have to get in your car and go drive to Jack in the Box to acquire? Well, obviously it's the former, because it's got place utility. Exactly, you popped out of your classroom, you go, and I'm not advocating Coke by any means, but it's just a good example. It's there when and where you want it. So obviously it creates place utility by being in the vending machine right outside your classroom. I would argue it also gives you some time utility because you don't have to go and get that item. So it's very important to think about utility, and it's a way of thinking about marketing more broadly. I said a minute ago that marketing is not just communicating, hey, Coke is wonderful and it'll add some zest to your life, but also think about making that Coke available when and where people want it. So that's why marketing is oftentimes referred to as the 4 Ps, or product, price, place, which is really distribution, and promotion. And you see in the example, there's a different type of vending machine, but that provides time and place utility by thinking about the distribution element of marketing. So, the marketing concept is the idea of providing goods and services that satisfy customers' needs through a coordinated set of activities that allow the firm to achieve its objectives. And I cannot emphasize enough the idea of satisfying customers' needs. Once in a while, our chef, who recently retired from the culinary program, used to lament the fact that students in the culinary program would come to him all the time and say, oh, I want to start a restaurant. I'm so excited. I love cooking, yada, yada, yada. And his point was well taken, not only that most restaurants fail, but also that, great, it's great that you love cooking, but is there a need in the market? That's your first question. Okay, so this marketing concept has not always been around, and in fact, initially there was the idea of just sell, sell, sell. Let's just make this transaction. So it's really been an evolution in thinking. And to illustrate the evolution of the customer orientation, I want to talk about the introduction of the Model T, the very first car. There's an anecdote that someone asked Henry Ford if he was going to make it in other colors. And as you might recall, if you've ever seen a history book, they were all black. And so his response was, well, the customer can have it in any color they want as long as the color is black. In other words, he wasn't going to be accommodating for the customer because he didn't have to. So the reason why marketers really have to accommodate the customer now is because with so many different options, if you don't give the customer exactly what they want, someone else will. So that really implies that one of the first steps in terms of giving the customer what they want is to understand what they want, is to obtain that type of understanding of the market. What do we mean by market? Well, a market is a group of individuals or organizations, that need a product or service, and they have the ability, willingness, and authority to purchase such products. And so case in point, you might say that you're selling a new type of software that will make it very, very easy for counselors to track students. Well, okay, counselors are sort of the market for that, but the question is, do they have the authority to make that purchase? So we can subdivide markets a couple different ways. We can think about B2B, which is business to business markets. There are also government markets and institutional markets, and of course consumer markets. But the business to business market is interesting because I think we so readily, let me go back to the previous slide, we so readily think about consumer markets in terms of marketing because we are part of the consumer market. We buy shampoo and dog food and all of that. But it is worth pointing out that half of all advertising expenses in the United States are in the B2B or business to business area. Okay, so let's think about marketing strategy. And I said earlier, I mentioned the 4 Ps. These are what are called the marketing mix of product, price, place or distribution, and promotion. And next chapter, we'll drill down a bit more in terms of promotion. We're going to jump over the distribution portion and kind of give short shrift to product, price, and distribution. And that's not to say that those aren't important. They're extremely important. But in the interest of time, we're going to focus a little bit more on promotion. So one of the first things to think about is not what you're going to promote, but who you're going to promote it to. And so let me just say, if you want to go out of business really, really quickly, one of the best ways to do it is when somebody asks you, who are you selling to? Who are you marketing bikes to? Is to say everyone, because that guarantees that you will not be the perfect match for anyone. And what you want to do is you want to very closely define your target market, which are those individuals who have the unique set of characteristics that they would be really attracted to your product. Now, granted, there are some products that can follow an undifferentiated approach, but these are actually, like salt is fairly undifferentiated. These are really few and far between. And in fact, even salt is getting to be a not such a great example, because if you've ever walked down a baking aisle, there are now so many different kinds of salts. So most products follow a segmented approach. So, if you think about soap or shampoo, at their foundation, they're really kind of similar. But they go after such distinct segments because especially a product like shampoo, people have the sense that they want something specifically for them. So you might segment and say we're going after people with dry hair, we're going after people with fine hair, we're going after people with dandruff. So you get the idea. So this gives you kind of a broad idea of segmentation for fragrances. One of the broadest ways of segmenting is by men versus women, because as we know, men don't want to smell womanly and womanly don't want to smell manly. So here's an ad for a scented product that is targeted towards women. Another good example of a differentiated approach. Who needs vitamins? Well, you could argue that everybody needs vitamins, or at least most of us. But you can differentiate based on age. You can segment based on age. And they do. And I really like this example. There are very different messages, and in fact, slightly different products based on age, based on what people need at different ages. It's not in the slide in front of you, but think about Centrum Silver. Also differentiated based on age. So a good example of segmenting the market for vitamins based on age and also based on gender. And that's a great example because women need more calcium than men, and kids need more calcium than male adults. And so it's a really good example of segmenting. So they're slightly changing the product, and more importantly, they're changing the way that it's communicated. Okay, so here's a graphic on a differentiated market segmentation. And we won't go into too much of this. I have a slightly different example that I'm going to use for the discussion forum. But ask yourself how you might segment the market for these products, for let's say recreational vehicles. So would you segment much as we did for vitamins? Would you segment based on what are called demographics? And specifically the demographics for vitamins, they segmented based on gender and they segmented based on age. Would you do something similar? Or would you segment based on other demographic variables? Would you segment based on psychographics or lifestyle? And RVs would seem like they would be segmented on lifestyle, right? So let's look at some of the common bases for market segmentation. These, broadly speaking, these are demographics, psychographics, geographics, and behavioristics. And you know what? Because there's so much to say about segmentation, I think I'm going to stop here and pick up the next segment on segmentation and drill down a bit further into each one of these four bases.